Ladies and gentlemen, could I have you take your seats, and we'll begin this evening's program. Okay, thank you. Distinguished guests, Mrs. Ko, ladies and gentlemen, fellows and students. I'm Greg Clancy, Master of Tembusu College, and it's my distinct pleasure to open the 12th Tembusu Forum this evening. There's been no issue too controversial for this series since we began it in 2011. We've debated whether Palestine should be admitted as a state to the United Nations, whether America should accommodate China's rise, whether China and Japan would go to war, and issues related specifically to Singapore, such as film censorship and universal health care. Tonight, we open this year's series with the broadest question we've ever asked: are human rights universal? It's not abstract or distant. It's arguably one of the key issues of the 21st century, of your future lifetimes. It was also a key question of the 20th century, when the United Nations sought to settle it by making a universal declaration of human rights. It was a key question of the 19th century, when 600,000 of my own countrymen killed each other because they couldn't even agree on who was human. And it was certainly controversial in the 18th century, when the notion was invented by a group of French philosophers and their admirers in other countries, a number of whom lost their heads. So for almost 250 years, countless acts of violence have been perpetrated by people who fundamentally had different ideas about what rights human beings had or deserved. And although we very often hear that the issue has something to do with East versus West or North versus South, and I think we may hear a little bit of that tonight, I think it's also historically indisputable that the vast majority of people who died fighting in opposition to the universality of human rights have been, by definition, Westerners. Even in the places where universal human rights, in other words, were invented as a concept, they've been highly controversial. The stage on which such issues are fought or debated is now much broader, however. It encompasses the whole world. On this stage, however, and within the walls of Tembusu College, human and even animal rights are uncontroversially universal, starting with the right of undergraduates to have first access to the microphones at either end of this auditorium during the question and answer sessions. So please, all of you, exercise your rights tonight and come to the microphones with good questions. As always, it is my pleasure at this point to call to the podium the founder and convener of the Tembusu Forum series, a man who has had to deal with this question concretely throughout his career as a diplomat, our esteemed rector, Professor Tommy Ko.
Thank you very much, Greg. I would like to join Professor Clancy in welcoming all of you to the first forum of the 2014-2015 academic year. I would like to especially welcome a few friends of mine, Mr. Chu Chaobing, the former CEO of Capo Corporation. Chaobing, welcome. I'd like to welcome one of the most respected journalists of Singapore, Radha. Radha, can you stand up? Radha Basu. And I'd like to welcome a new member of the EU delegation to Singapore, who only arrived in Singapore yesterday from the Netherlands, Vienna. In deciding what topic to discuss for the forum tonight, I consulted the student leaders and the president of the student common room, is that what you call it? Angus, who's here. Angus, could you put up your hand? Angus advised me that the theme of the orientation this year was human rights. And could I please pick a topic relevant to human rights? So in consultation with Angus, I asked him whether I could post as the topic for our discussion this evening, are human rights truly universal? And he said yes. So Angus, thank you for helping me to frame the issue. Some of you may wonder why this question is worthy of discussion. Isn't it axiomatic that human rights are universal? One could say that yes, human rights are universal because there are many foundational documents which reflect and express humankind's shared aspirations, beginning with the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the two covenants, the International Covenant of Social, Economic, Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And we have many other very important conventions. Conventions against genocide, slavery, torture, convention to end discrimination against women, racial discrimination, and so on. So one can say that there is a substantial corpus of laws and rules which appear to reflect our universal aspirations. So it would be easy to say, therefore, that yes, human rights are universal. But there is a second school of thought. The second school of thought doesn't deny that there are some human rights that are universal and should not in any way be denied or modified. But members of the second school of thought would also argue that the interpretation and application of specific human rights must take into account the context, the history of a country, its culture, its religious traditions, and so on. And I guess I can best typify this by referring you to the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. I've asked Margaret to post on the college's portal, right, the Phnom Penh Statement, the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, and an article written by a colleague of mine, Bilahari Kausikan, giving so-called East Asian view of human rights. Let me just refer to the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. The ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, in some of its articles, refers not just to rights, but to also responsibilities. Yeah? So let me just read a few examples. Article 6 of the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. This is a section on general principles. It says the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms must be balanced with the performance of corresponding duties, as every person has responsibilities to all other individuals, the community, and the society in which one lives. Some of my, and I will not read Articles 7 and 8, but Articles 7 and 8 too tries to pair rights with responsibilities. Some of my Western friends take exception to this because they feel that the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights should have conformed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and focus exclusively on rights. But I think many people in Asia feel that the correlative of right is duty, that we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. And so this is obviously a topic that's worthy of discussion this evening. Another possible example is the European campaign to abolish capital punishment in the world. Yeah? the world is probably divided into one-third, one-third, one-third. One-third of the country that has capital punishment, one-third do not have capital punishment, and a third that has a moratorium on capital punishment, roughly in that proportion. So the question is the European Union and those who share that view right in saying that there should be a universal consensus to abolish capital punishment because it is a form of cruel and unusual punishment, and that the death penalty does not have any unique deterrent effect. So that's another issue that we can discuss later. All I want to do without prejudging the discussion is to say that there are two legitimate points of view, and we want to discuss them this evening. We have three very good speakers this evening, and I will introduce them one at a time, beginning with somebody I admire very much, Professor Walter Wundt. By the way, each speaker has 15 minutes, so I would request them to try to keep within the allocated time. Professor Walter Wundt is a dear friend and colleague from the law school. He holds the David Marshall Chair. He's one of Singapore's authorities on company law. He is concurrently the Dean of the Singapore Institute of Legal Education. He has a major responsibility of supervising the postgraduate education of lawyers and preparing them for admission to practice law. Walter had a very distinguished career, not only in academia, but also in diplomacy and in government service. He served twice as Singapore's ambassador, beginning in Germany, in Berlin, and where, because he's a genius, he learned the German language very quickly. I think, Walter, you were concurrently accredited to Greece, am I right? Greece and the Vatican. And he subsequently served in Brussels as our ambassador to the European Union, to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. On his return to Singapore, he was the Solicitor General and then the Attorney General. Some of the younger people here may not know that he was also a nominated Member of Parliament and served for 2 terms. And the 2 terms were very productive because he was, it was a very unusual achievement for a nominated Member of Parliament, or indeed any Member of Parliament, to move a private member's bill and to see that bill enacted as law. He is the inspiration behind our Maintenance of Parents Act. Yeah. So those of you who got elderly parents and you don't like this law, you can blame him. But as I'm an elderly parent, I think I welcome Walter's initiative. So it is with great pleasure that I asked Walter to speak to us for 15 minutes. He said he's going to speak from the chair. Please.
Professor Koh, Professor Clancy, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you've heard of Robert Morley. He was an actor long before all of you were born, probably, and in afterlife he became an after-dinner speaker. So he would go around giving talks, and he went to one of these women's groups where he had an audience of women. He stood and gave them a talk, and they were watching him with rapt attention. At the end of the, and he thought, this is very good, they're actually paying attention to what I say. At the end of the talk, he said, does anyone have any questions? The little old lady in the front put up her hand and said, Mr. Morley, why is your zip down? And he said, Madam, it's to enhance the informality of the occasion. But to avoid Robert Morley's fate, I'm going to sit down. Right? But seriously, I've been on my feet for the last 3 hours talking about company law. So I hope you will not think it discourteous if I sit down and talk to you. Do not believe Professor Koh's introduction. He has oversold the product. I'm not an expert on human rights law. I claim no special expertise. The only contact I had with it was when I was his alternate at the high-level task force for the drafting of the ASEAN Charter. And one of the most contentious issues that we had was this issue of human rights. In fact, the negotiations on the Charter almost broke over the issue of the human rights mechanism, as we call it. Professor Koh will remember this. I remember this 12th September 2007 in Chiang Mai. So it was an extremely contentious thing. If I understand the topic correctly, which I hope I have, we're not here to debate the rights and wrongs of human rights and who is correct and who's not. We're here to talk about universality of human rights. And if you'll just give me one moment, I will try and retrieve what I've written. Actually, I didn't realize that it was going to be such a serious thing, so I'm making this up as I go along, so you will excuse me, I hope, if I stumble occasionally. Right? And if my computer doesn't work, I'm really going to have to make it up. Right? Basically, when we talk about universality of human rights, sorry, is this off? Can you hear me? Can. I'm sorry, people at the back can't hear me. I think I shall have to speak up a bit. Is that all right now? At the back? Fine. When we talk about universality of human rights, I interpret that to mean whether or not there is a consensus on human rights. Now, there is a consensus that there is such a thing as human rights, because even our ASEAN colleagues eventually had to accept this. The ones that were most resistant were what we call the CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam. They didn't want to talk about it, but eventually they were persuaded to, and that's why we have an ASEAN human rights mechanism, which is now the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. We're not here to talk about whether this is effective, whether it's got enough teeth. That's a whole different issue. We're here to talk about content. Is there such a thing as universal human rights? Human rights among some people has become a new religion, right? And in a de-Christianized Europe, if I may be forgiven, Faustenhammer, in a de-Christianized Europe, it has replaced traditional religion as the religion of the Europeans. And like other religions, there are fanatics, there are people who claim that they are the final arbiters of doctrine. There are two aspects to this. And let me emphasize here that I speak for no one but myself. I'm not associated with the government. I don't speak for the government. Don't blame me for what the government does. Right? There are two aspects to this. First thing is something a human right in the first place? Is it a human right? Is there a consensus on what human rights are? And second place, if it is a human right, how do we interpret it? Where are the limits? How does one implement it? More importantly, who gets to say whether or not the interpretation is correct? I've spent a sixth of my life living in Europe, in Cambridge, in Bonn, in Brussels, and in Berlin. So I have some familiarity with the European view and some sympathy for parts of the European view, not all of it. But remember, there is no single European view any more than there is a single Asian view. Different countries have different interpretations, and we talk about the West as if it was monolithic. It's not. And we talk about Asia as if it's monolithic. It is definitely not. So we mustn't fall into that trap of looking at it as block to block. Right? The problem with human rights is that they're not black and white. The color of human rights is not black and white. It's gray, 50 shades of gray. And that's the problem, because we have to work out where black turns to white, and that can be terribly difficult. Professor Koh has referred to the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, which tries to balance off rights and responsibilities. That wasn't the first. The Interaction Council back in the 90s also tried to promulgate an international declaration of human responsibilities. It was supported by people like Helmut Schmidt, the former German Chancellor, Malcolm Fraser, the former Australian Prime Minister, Miyazaki Kiichi, I can't remember the Japanese one, former Japanese Prime Minister. It was supported by Jimmy Carter, the former American president. From Asia, it was supported by Shimon Peres, outside Europe, the former Israeli Prime Minister. Anand Panayartun, the former Thai Prime Minister, and of course, not to forget mentioning Lee Kuan Yew. Right? So there was an attempt to balance rights with responsibilities. But again, we're not talking about this. We're talking about human rights. The whole responsibilities thing is a different issue. All I would like to say is that all our moral codes are not based on rights. Our moral codes are based on responsibilities. Not I have a right, but I have a responsibility to my fellow man to behave properly. But let me leave that. Are human rights universal? The answer is it depends on what we're talking about. We have a useful checklist in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. It was drafted in 1947 after the end of the war, under the chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt, and it was a very difficult thing. At that time, the vast majority of the countries represented were from the West. There were very few non-Western countries. China was there, and if you read what Eleanor Roosevelt said about that, you will see that the Chinese delegates actually tried to push for responsibilities and had a different view. And she said it was extraordinarily difficult to find some common ground. So back in 47, 48, it was already difficult. But there's a list there, and the Universal Declaration has been accepted by practically every country in the world as representing customary international law. The question is, all right, so we got this list, people accept it. But what about new rights? The list that we've got, most people would accept, represent human rights. But there is a constant evolution, certainly in the West, where people are pushing and saying, there is this new right, there is that new right. Right? So for example, gay rights become a matter of human rights. I was in England this summer just for a trip, and there was a minor furore about school uniforms. And some parents said, you know, it's a matter of human rights that you can't force my child to wear a uniform. So it's become so banal in some places. Who gets to decide what the new rights are? Is it only the West, or can others do this? Right? I've got 15 minutes, so we can't go into great detail. But the Arab states, back I think in the early 2000s, tried to introduce in the UN a right for religion not to be defamed, a law against blasphemy. They said every person has a right to practice his religion without being defamed and insulted. And these were the Arab states. And there are about 30 countries, I'm told, that have laws against blasphemy. But when it came to the UN, this was shot down by the Western countries. They said, no, there's no such human right against blasphemy. There is according to the UN Declaration on Human Rights, everyone can practice his religion, and that includes the right to change religions. Now, this is not accepted by the Muslim countries, that you should have a human right to change your religion. And if you look at the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, you will not find it there. You won't find it in the ASEAN Declaration. So is that bit of the Universal Declaration universal? Because the Muslim world certainly disagrees with it. Professor Koh referred to the Maintenance of Parents Act. Let's do a thought experiment. Let us assume that Confucian Asia comes to a consensus that it is a human right for an elderly parent to be supported by his children. Would anyone disagree with this? I'm not asking for opinions now. But let's say Confucian Asia says elderly parents have this right. It is a basic human right. You bring up your children have an obligation to support you. You have that right. Would the West accept this? Or is it only the West that can create new rights? That is the issue. And the impression that I have had, and this may be wrong, is that when you deal with people in Europe and America, they seem to assume that only they have the right to prescribe what is a human right and what is not, and that other people don't. Now, they got used to this over the last 2 centuries of European colonialism, but the attitudes still persist. So the first question about universality is who gets to say what new rights there are, or whether or not the list that we have, in fact, is universal. I've already pointed out one, the right to change a religion. I pointed out the Muslim idea that there should be a law against blasphemy. Right? In Europe, they have a different idea about religious freedom and how it relates to freedom of speech. In Holland, Netherlands, there was a gentleman, I hesitate to call him a gentleman, a man called Theo van Gogh. You may not have heard of him. Theo van Gogh was a distant relative of the painter who cut off his ear. Right? And he was a particularly nasty person. He was the fella who called Muslims, amongst other things, goat fuckers, amongst other things. And he said, I have a right to do this. He was killed in broad daylight by a Muslim fanatic called Muhammad Bouyeri. Europeans were saying he's got a right to say this. And of course, Bouyeri was absolutely wrong. But the point is that once you allow this to happen, the relationship between religions and groups becomes so poisoned that you have people like Muhammad Bouyeri who stabbed Van Gogh in broad daylight, left the knife in him with a note. When he was arrested, said, I deny your right to try me, and I would do it again. Now, in Singapore, we would never accept that. We have not accepted that. There was a case a couple of years ago where we had some Christian fundamentalists who were popping tracts into the post boxes of Muslims. Tracts published by an American publisher called Chick Publications. Amongst these tracts were statements that the Prophet was a pedophile and that the Pope was the Antichrist. And we prosecuted them because we said, no, folks, your right to religion does not extend that far. Your right to expression does not extend that far. Which brings me to the second point. We accept that you have a right to free expression. Who determines how far that right goes? We very often get criticized because we have restrictions on the right to free expression. And as I said, I'm not responsible for what the government does down here. But we have restrictions. The Americans have a different idea of free expression from us. The Americans have a different idea of free expression from the Europeans. One example, we were talking over dinner about the German and Austrian prohibition on Holocaust denial. Right? It's in Austria, it's in something called the Verbotsgesetz, if I'm correct. Verbotsgesetz, which prohibits basically Nazi symbols. So it's not just Holocaust denial, it's also the display of overt Nazi symbols. This is in Austria. In Germany, they have got, what is it called, the Strafgesetz? Oder was? Strafgesetzbuch. It's in the Strafgesetzbuch, the German Penal Code. They've got something called Volksverhetzung, incitements of hatred, which prohibits people from inciting hatred. And this means that they can actually stop people from praising Nazis. This kind of thing is obviously a restriction on free speech, and the Americans don't accept this. In America, you will find reenactment groups. Just do a Google search. Look for Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The Americans have a reenactment group that reenacts the first SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's bodyguard. This was a Waffen-SS unit. And you know that the SS, after the war, was proclaimed to be a criminal organization. The Leibstandarte was one of the worst. You do a Google search, you will find reenactment groups for 9th SS, Hohenstaufen. And this is just, it took me 4 seconds to find this stuff. The Americans have a totally different view. Now, does this mean that there is no universal right to freedom of expression? Obviously there is. We all accept that. The problem is, where does the limit lie? The Austrians and the Germans, because of their history and because of the sensitivity, will say, no, you cannot deny the Holocaust. No, you cannot wear the swastika. No, you cannot have reenactment groups. Even model planes with swastikas, I'm told, are precluded. You cannot sell them. If we introduce laws to say, no, you cannot incite religious and racial problems or hate speech or whatever, we get criticized from America and from the West. And here, the question is, who gets to say? It's not cultural relativism. It's not cultural. We're not saying that there are certain things that we can do which you can't do. We're saying that when we try and translate this into something meaningful, we have to take into account the sensitivities of our own people. And that is not cultural relativism. So I hope I haven't gone over time, right? I think I will stop here. So let me just summarize what I'm saying, okay? Number one, are human rights universal? Yes, the idea of human rights is universal. We accept that. Are the actual human rights universal, the content? Yes, but it depends on what. Some of them are, some of them aren't. For example, the right to change your religion, not taken by everyone. The right to property, not in the ASEAN Declaration, right? So there are certain things. What about the rights we accept exist? The interpretation of those rights. Can that interpretation, is there one authority? The answer is no, it's not. Although the West often arrogates to itself the right to tell others, this is correct, this is not correct. So we will have debates over whether or not something is in fact a human right. We will have debates as to the extent of the rights. Our countries, even countries in Europe and America, have sensitivities where they restrict their rights. All we ask is that you respect our sensitivities in the same way that you expect others to respect your sensitivities. Whether or not something is a right within a society, or how far that extends, that has to be a matter of domestic concern. Whether or not there is a right for gays to marry, it's not an international thing. Is our society ready for this? If we look at the cultural battles in the States and in Europe, we know that it's got to be done domestically. Is there a right against blasphemy? It's got to be settled within a country. Is there a right not to display Nazi symbols? It's got to be settled within a country. Right? So I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Walter for a very thoughtful presentation. Raises many questions for us to think about. I'm now going to call on the second speaker, who is a very good friend and somebody I admire also. Bremer Marti. She's had 4 lives. 4 lives in one lifetime. She began as a teacher. Then she was a journalist. Then she was a researcher, and now she's a social activist. But I want to tell you a good story about her. When she was reporting on education and she visited our schools, she discovered that some of our students in our school were so poor that they came to school with no pocket money to buy lunch. Something that many of us were not aware of. She highlighted this to her seniors in the newspaper and persuaded the Straits Times to launch the Straits Times Pocket Money Fund, a charity that many of us give money to. So Brema, that's one of your many positive legacy to Singapore. She has been the president of our most prestigious women's organization, AWARE, the Association of Women for Action and Research. She's the founder of the Transcend Workers 2, TW2, right? Which tries to advocate the interests and rights of transcend workers in Singapore. She's currently president of an human rights NGO, Marua. And it is in this capacity that I asked Brema to join us. Brema, please come and share your thoughts with us.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me, and I thank Margaret, who has been very patient with all the emails, giving exact directions how to get to Tembusu, etc. Thank you very much. And I thank all of y'all for coming here to listen to human rights truly universal. And I think Prof. Tomiko, as always, is very generous with all his comments and compliments. And I think this whole topic has been troubling me for some years, but it has come together from Sunday because we always talk about human rights and the universality of human rights. And then as soon as you touch that, out comes similar discussions about whether Asians can think, just to cite a book, whether Asians are better, whether the Western world is better, etc. And I find that sometimes we tend to focus, not wrong, we tend to focus on it that we can lose sight of what actually human rights needs to mean to us. And in the context of Singapore, I think, and ASEAN, we have a lot of areas that I think we ought to be pushed against the wall, perhaps, to look at it more closely and to look at issues in the mirror at ourselves. And I was yesterday in a discussion, a half-day discussion, and we were talking about aging. And we have now made it clearer to ourselves as a community discussing on this, that it cannot be done by the government alone, although all of us agreed that the government has to do more, that it cannot be done by the family. We have always talked about family. Caring is within the family. It is getting to be a challenge to just keep it within the family. It cannot also be for the individual, despite the act, which is a good act. It is still a struggle, and the corporate sector. So we have grown in a way to include 4 actors or stakeholders, which is another word that we use. And how are they going to play their part in this? Then I threw something into the arena. I said, oftentimes we tend to talk about the person who's aging. Very quickly we don't walk down, I think we roll down this slippery slope and end up talking about the person growing older as a burden. Sooner or later, the caregiving comes up, burden, grumbling, and the word that was used yesterday was, we start, without even realizing it, we start devaluing the person, D-value, devaluing the person. And that alone is an irony, is also a parody for all of us, that we need to wonder, when the child is born Oh, so cute, so wonderful, oh, so clever, can pick up this, can do that. But as we grow older, the devaluing is not the D that we want. The D that we want has to be the dignity of the individual has to be maintained. So then it came to this question, have we put the rights of the individual person, the one growing older, more in the center of our discussion? And this is a group of experts on aging. Going round the room, most felt that it is not so. That it is up to the family, that's transfer of the whole process even to the foreign domestic worker or to the institutional setups. So then we talked about what then is the norm. What is the universal, perhaps, if I use that word, when it comes to taking care of the older person? We find that there is the Madrid International Plan of Aging. We find that WHO has come up with a whole schema, not only the principles, but a whole schema to keep us more unified in our approach to how we want to look after the older person. So at the end, just to put it in context to this discussion, we could have gone down that road just to speak. What is the Western concept of looking after an older person? What is the Asian? What is the notion? How do tribal communities look after their older person? What about Native Americans? And if we go through all our big landscape of communities, it will still be different from one community to another. It will not be uniform. But what is the principle on which we operate is the one that I think is most important in the discussion of human rights. And I think Prof. Walter Woon also made it clear that it is the principle, it is the value system. It's just that me operating from a non-governmental organization perspective, I feel we do not have the luxury or the time to start going through, is yours better, is mine better, because at the end of the day, it has to reside in a place where we understand what is the stake for you as an individual if we do not come up with a principled approach to valuing you from the time you are born up till you die. And today that whole process is called the life course approach. So what am I going to talk about then? I find that these are some highlights. Like I said, I struggled with this whole topic, how deep, how wide, and all to go. I just wish to talk about I would like to elaborate a bit more on the universal, the regional, and some notions of national approaches to human rights. The most important thing about human rights is it has to promote human rights for all of us. It has to protect me from abuses as well as protect me in my own circle, that I get all the different things to the best of one's ability. It has to fulfill my human rights. We hardly talk about fulfill. How do I become a being? How do I become a person who can enjoy one's spirituality, one's physical access to many things, etc.? Structures, mandates, and limitations. Sometimes they come together. We try our best to develop the Universal Declaration, the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, constitutions, laws, etc. But all of them have their own limitations at various points in time. Therefore, then what is the structure? We can develop a wonderful thing, but if we don't have the structure, then how are we going to protect? How are we going to promote, and how are we going to fulfill, which are the fundamentals to human rights? And a whole process of justice, the application, and I have put this as a question. We have talked a lot in Singapore as state, private, people. Is that still the norm, or are we changing in our dynamics of whether it is people, state, private? Is it more flat, more linear, more hierarchical? Different countries have got different approaches. How is Singapore also changing in this context? And the evolutionary approach. Whenever you touch human rights, it's evolution, step by step, etc. But sometimes, I put verses, sometimes we can go into rationalizing the why not or the why. For example, recently, Brunei, the Sultan of Brunei, has passed hudud laws. It has shocked all of us in ASEAN, because a hudud law will then mean, it has already been passed, that if a woman or a man, but the way sometimes the law is interpreted can fall, the burden of proof falls on the woman, that she can be flogged. So I raised it in a quiet moment with a woman in Brunei who's holding a high up position. And then she told me, Bremer, don't talk about it. So I said, why? Why not? She said, he just has to pass the law. It will not happen. He's passing the law for political reasons. It will not happen to any of the women. And I was like, how long are you going to guard that point that it will not happen to any of the women? Because laws too can be politicized in their interpretation, as well as it can be to protect the individual. So look at where we have developed the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, and then a national law comes into being, which is at a contradictory point to the regional declaration, and of course also to the Universal Declaration. So does this mean then, the more important question, is a customary law? So what do we do? It is their religion, so we leave it alone. But in Singapore, bravo to the few communities, they have already held a forum to interpret the Quran in this case, to see where does such a law even reside in the interpretation of such hudud laws. And again, this is the best part, we have a diversity of views. So when we have a diversity of views, and the people are not just NGOs renting away, they are very well established academics, lawyers, etc., then passing a law, without consultation, etc., becomes hugely intrusive to my rights, my individual human rights, if I were to reside in Brunei, and if I were to live my life in a way that may not really be state approved. I'm just using that as an example to show, it's a real case, it's not made up, to just show why a universal approach based on the principle of human rights is very important. The application will vary from country to country, from society to society. It will always have its downside. As Prof. Woon also shared, if my freedom of speech is going to cause you a lot of harm, does it then mean that I cannot speak? Is that so wrong of me to speak? If I am abusive, surely there must be a protection, promote, protect, fulfill. There must be a counter protective law there in place to make sure that I can take you to task for being abusive against me. That is how the negotiation and the balancing takes place. That is how many of us also see it. Human rights will always be a contentious area depending where we are coming from. And I put there this thing, New World Order, or is it a question of reclaiming? Every time you hear this in some of the ASEAN level discussions, and sometimes in Singapore, we are moving into a new world, globalized world, etc. I do not know the right answer. That's why it's a Are we reclaiming, in a process of reclaiming, or is it really a new world order? What do I mean by that? Let's look at our past histories. At one time, we used to burn the witches, so-called witches, at the stake. We have decided you're a witch, we burn you. At one time, Indian women, Hindu women, had to throw themselves on the funeral pyre because it is seen as a customary cultural approach that when the husband dies, you too, it was packaged as you too, out of love and duty and responsibility to the husband, you have to throw yourself on the funeral pyre. But today, all these are outlawed. The law has protected people. And there has been, is it a new world order, or is it people saying this is really wrong? It is against the right of an individual to have this being done to her, etc. The suffrage movement that took place, now 2 centuries and 1.5 ago, depending which country, it did not have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at that time. But women themselves felt that the right to vote has to belong to them too, not just to the men. And they fought for it, and New Zealand was the first country to get the right to vote for women. So where do all these come from? And this is what I would like to raise, that there is an intuitiveness in all of us to feel appreciated, to feel that we have a space as the same as the other party. And how are we going to get that space will become what I call systemic approaches. Before, if it's a small village, it's a village headman, whatever. But today, as we become more complex, we have different systems. So, and this is where I just want to highlight a few things. If we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I mean, there are 30, but I think the most important in my view is that Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Born free in dignity and rights. And I think if that is the approach we take, responsibility will come in almost automatically. Because if you are to be born free in dignity, equal and in dignity, then I have to respect you, your space, your notions of dignity as much as you have to respect mine. But have we made it into a value system? The other one is Article 29. Everyone has duties to the community. I can't be my own island and do all this blasphemous stuff, etc. Yes, I can, but you are a crazy person and something will catch up with you. But I have a duty to the community, a responsibility. And if from there I were to look at how we have moved on globally, we have international human rights treaties that have come out from the UDHR, CEDAW, the first one, CRC for children. So the UN and the Human Rights Council has even tried its best to look after all the communities. Today, one of the areas that is coming up is a convention to protect the older person. Some countries have different points of view, so it's at the negotiation table that these rights are drawn up. People with disabilities. And incidentally, Singapore was the last ASEAN country to ratify on this. And then we have the ASEAN human rights. A lot of declarations that have started from even the Bangkok thing was 1998, earlier than that. So we have had so many declarations, but there's a big difference between a declaration and a convention, ratification, state obligations, etc. And then we have the ASEAN Charter, the most important document in ASEAN because it is a governance book, it's a code of conduct, it's legally binding. The words are there: respect for fundamental freedoms, the promotion, protection of human rights, etc. And and it is from there that ASEAN will develop its approaches to the people in ASEAN. However, the limitation that I talked about is also there, sovereignty issues, non-interference, which then means the whole incident in Brunei may not come up at an ASEAN discussion, but on a one-to-one, perhaps some states will talk about it, but not at an area of concern for ASEAN. And we have had Mr. Sompop Somphon, who is actually married to a Singaporean, a Laotian, who has disappeared. There's no news. We have all asked many times of the Laotian government. And the good news is our Prime Minister too has asked the Laotian minister, what has happened to this guy? So then, and there's no answer. So it becomes, what's the code? The code has to have transparency in information, especially when it is disappearance of an individual who is an activist on the ground, and from what we hear, a very good capacity builder for the community. It is coming to 2 years. We still do not have news, and his Singapore wife lobbies our government, lobbies the UN, lobbies many folks within the ASEAN region to just get a scrap of news about where's the husband. So the challenges, even within the ASEAN side, remains. People at the bottom, people-oriented and not people-centered. When we develop a charter, I know everyone has worked very hard and it almost collapsed at that time, but NGOs are asking, is it time or isn't it time to make it people-centered rather than people-oriented, right? And we go on to yet the situation in ASEAN. We have still many women not educated, MMR, maternal mortality rate is high, children not going to school, etc., etc. And we also have situations of deep and abject poverty. And I come to AICHA, which is Article 14 of the ASEAN Charter. AICHA is our body that governs over the ASEAN Declaration on Human Rights. They too have shared, individually they have shared. They are putting in a lot of time, good work, migration as a work plan, CSR as a work plan, but they are struggling with the lack of a proper protective mandate. What do we mean by a protective mandate? In some regions, they have a court, they have a process. We haven't gone there yet. So there's a lot of reports, there's a lot of sharing of information, but when does protection come in? At the national level, we have laws to protect us. We may not agree with all the laws, and we also have to lobby for some amendments, but at least there is a law. In the ASEAN side, it is a struggle. So for certain countries, ASEAN will be a better way to go because the national laws are problematic. In some countries, maybe like Singapore, we will prefer to work with our own national laws. And we have a women's commission, we have a migrant commission. What I'm trying to show here is we have different groups to take care of different communities. But the structure of ASEAN that I was talking about, this is an old diagram, is complex, it is difficult to navigate. I hear that it has improved. Then how the system is equally important if we want to really apply ourselves to human rights. And so at the national level, then what do I have to say? I think we have a lot of laws and a lot of programs and a lot of policies that can take care of our social issues and those who are struggling quite badly. What I mean badly is that they are below certain lines. We do not have, nevertheless, a clear poverty line. There are many figures that have been thrown up. We do not have minimum wages. The wages of the cleaners has finally been improved, but is it substantive enough? Why do I raise that question? Under any society, if I'm born equal and to be treated with dignity, I work hard. I wake up in the morning, I clean, I sweep your estate, I do whatever. The money I get in my hand must sustain me and my family. But if it is not enough to sustain me and my family, it is not actually it's not my failure. It is the failure of the four groups, the government, the private sector, me and you, whether we care enough about that person. And the individual also for not speaking up about their own situation loudly enough. So when we talk about loudly enough, I need to talk about our civil and political space. We have restrictions on our civil and political space, but the government is moving into a lot of conversation arenas. And if I talk to you, my minister or my MP, and it still doesn't go very far, then I can cite that I cannot live my life with dignity because of these problems, because my wages are too low, etc. And look at my map. Look at my mind map of survival. There are problems. What can you do? And the community has to come together. So I'm just sharing a few examples here. And what then is the last part? Universal is here, but it cannot be applied all the time in the same dosage or the same way. But it is a principle. I mean, if you read up the documents about how, as Prof. Walter Woon also has said, in 1948, how they came up with the UDHR, and interestingly enough, the Burmese, I forgot his name, the Burmese guy was part of the team to craft the UDHR with Eleanor Roosevelt. And where did Burma go after being involved in the UDHR? This is how, if we don't keep our eye on the ball, on what we believe that you and I and society, we are born to be equal and to be treated with dignity, not only for myself, but for you, my fellow citizen, my fellow member of the global society, then I think we have not really understood human rights as a value system. So thank you very much. Yeah.
I thank Brema. As you can see, Brema feels very passionately about human rights, and she's given us a very broad-ranging presentation which covers a lot of ground. In addition to answering the question of the forum, are human rights truly universal? But she's given us a very comprehensive presentation. I just want to make a couple of comments about this NGO leader in Laos who has gone missing. His name is Somba, not Sompong, but Somba. Yeah. He disappeared soon after Laos hosted the Asia-Europe meeting. And the wife is a good friend of mine. I want to assure Brema that the Singapore government has taken up this issue with the Laotian government at the highest level. This is not for reporting, so rather I'll be grateful if you don't report it. The answer we've got back from the Laotian government is that they are not responsible for his disappearance. They don't know where he is. So even if you have the most effective ASEAN Commission on Human Rights, things like this still can happen, you know. So what it means really is to strengthen good governance in each of the 10 ASEAN countries. You can't expect the Commission to prevent abuses from taking place in specific countries. Your concern about Brunei, I'm not sure whether the Sultan's enactment of Sharia law in Brunei, whether it's a contradiction of the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. And what Brunei is seeking to do has been done by other Islamic countries. Saudi Arabia, for example, has for the longest time implemented hudud law for crimes committed in the kingdom. If you are committed of theft in Saudi Arabia, they will amputate your right hand. If you are caught, convicted for adultery, they will stone you to death, you know. Now, are such punishments, which are apparently in consonance with Islamic law, are they a violation of human rights as we understand it? I think I'll ask Walter to answer that question. But I want to introduce our next speaker, and I hope, Bernhard Faustenhammer, that you will stay focused on the issue before the forum. Human rights, truly universal. Mr. Bernhard Faustenhammer is head of the Department of Press and Politics in the EU delegation to Singapore. He's an Austrian diplomat who's seconded to the European Union and is based here in Singapore. I want to say some good words about the European Union, because the European Union doesn't enjoy a good press in Singapore or in Asia generally. But I want to say that I'm an admirer of the European Union. If you look at what happened in Europe in the last century, the Europeans were responsible for starting 2 world wars, the First World War and Second World War. So in the first half of the 20th century, Europe was really the world's killing fields, you know. But something miraculous happened in the second half of the 20th century. After the Second World War, inspiring and visionary leaders of Europe decided to put a stop to this, and that the Europeans will no longer raise arms against each other. They wanted to consolidate peace in Europe, and they did so by integrating the economies and by regionalizing the implements of war, starting with the coal community, iron community. And if you look at the progress that the European Union has made in the last 50 years, and compare that to what happened in Europe in the first half of the 20th century, I would say the European Union is a miracle of the 20th century, that it has secured prosperity and peace in Europe. And although Europe is still going through a tough time, I would say the European Union is still probably the world's largest regional economy. It was until recently Singapore's largest trading partner. It is now our 3rd largest trading partner. Our biggest trading partner is now China, and Malaysia is number 2, and EU is number 3. But EU is a very important economic player in the world economy. And for this reason, Singapore has negotiated a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we're hoping that sometime this year, or maybe next year, the EU-Singapore FTA will be ratified by the member states and by the European Parliament. So I want to tell Bernhard that I'm an admirer of the EU. I think you represent the most successful regional organization in the world, and that when I compare the first and second half of the last century in Europe, the first half was a disaster and the second half was a miracle. So I'm glad that you represent the miracle. Come and speak to her.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Koh, for this glowing introduction. So, just to, so to say, break up the flow of speech, you're going to see a short video now, which lasts about 2 minutes, yeah? And this shows you the chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights of the European Parliament speaking about the activities of that subcommittee. It put things into perspective and maybe also breathe a little bit of life into what Professor Koh just said.
Mein Name ist Barbara Lochbiller. Ich bin die Vorsitzende des Unterausschusses für Menschenrechte. Ich komme aus Deutschland, genauer aus Bayern, und bin Mitglied der Grünen Partei. In unserem Menschenrechtsausschuss haben wir einen Fokus darauf, die Menschenrechtssituation in den unterschiedlichsten Ländern zu verbessern. Wie tun wir das? Indem wir Anhörungen organisieren zu bestimmten Themen, zum Beispiel, welche Entscheidungen des Interamerikanischen Gerichtshofs haben welche Auswirkungen auf Menschenrechtsaktivisten in Kolumbien und in Mexiko. Oder wir organisieren Fachdiskussionen über die Rolle von Unternehmen. Was können sie verantwortlich und verbindlich tun, dass ihr Handeln in bestimmten Ländern nicht zu einer Verschlechterung führt. Wir bringen das Ganze ins Plenum des Parlaments und werden darüber regelmäßig, so jeden Monat zum Beispiel, darüber abstimmen. Wir haben also eine sehr volle Agenda und in den nächsten 2 Jahren kümmern wir uns darum, auch zu schauen, wie kann die EU und wir im Parlament unsere Instrumente noch verbessern. Wie können wir konkreter werden, dass wirklich der einzelne Mensch, egal in welchem Teil der Erde er lebt, eine Verbesserung seiner Situation erlebt. Selbstverständlich sind Situationen wie in China, in Russland, in der Türkei oder in der afrikanischen Region der großen Seen, wie in der Demokratischen Republik Kongo, immer auf unserer Agenda, weil die Situation dort sehr besorgniserregend ist. Aber wir schauen auch manchmal auf sich verbessernde Situationen, wie zum Beispiel jetzt in Burma, wo es Veränderungen gibt. Und da versuchen wir mit unserem Engagement und unserer Debatte diejenigen zu unterstützen, die auch für eine Verbesserung sind. Nun, wir wissen, und das motiviert uns sehr, dass viele oder die Mehrheit der europäischen Bürger und Bürgerinnen von der europäischen Politik verlangen, sich für die Menschenrechte einzusetzen. Warum tun sie das? Ich glaube, sie wissen sehr genau, was Kofi Annan, der frühere Generalsekretär, einmal präzise formuliert hat. Die Menschenrechtsverletzungen von heute sind die Kriege von morgen. Und wir Europäerinnen wissen, dass man präventiv handeln muss, nicht zuwarten, bis es einen Krieg oder einen Bürgerkrieg gibt, sondern wir müssen Menschenrechte in allen Ländern stärken, dass die Konflikte, die es immer gibt, friedlich gelöst werden.
Okay, this was a short introduction. If I shut this is probably going to turn off the screen. We just need, no, yes it does. Anyway, you know which event you're at and the photos have been shot, yeah? So I think this gives you a glimpse of how things look from Europe. Yeah? There is a strong, I would say, popular impetus for human rights to be implemented within Europe, but also to be promoted around the world. Yeah? And the European Parliament has been very much a guardian of that ambition. It has also given the EU's executive, like the External Action to which I belong, a lot of guidance on how that should best be done. Yeah? So I was going to hit you with a huge speech. Yeah? You have now heard from Professor Woon and from Bremer a lot about universality, and you're actually getting very tired, as I can tell. So I will try to really summarize my points in just maybe 2 or 3 theses. First of all, I think I owe you a certain amount of disclosure. Yeah? First of all, I'm a firm believer in universality. I've grown up in Geneva, which is the seat of the Human Rights Council. My hometown, Vienna, was the venue of one of the great human rights conferences in 1993, as Professor Woon already alluded to. Yeah? And in my diplomatic career as an Austrian diplomat, I've spent actually a lot of time working with Holocaust survivors, victims of National Socialism. I've tried to make right some of the horrors of the past, helping people claim compensation for their past suffering. So if you want, even if I'm far too young to have lived through the post-war era, this notion of never again a catastrophe like that of the first half of the century in Europe, which peaked in the tremendous destruction and crimes of National Socialism, happen again. And so this is also where I'm coming from, and this is where my 3 theses are really rooted. My first thesis is that universality is a core element of human rights. You can actually not really think human rights without envisioning them as being universal. My second thesis is that universality, although it's rooted in the very notion of human rights, still remains an aspiration and work in progress. Yeah? I believe that the acceptance of the universality of human rights is growing incrementally but steadily around the world. Yeah? Finally, I think what we've just heard about the ASEAN declaration and the ASEAN mechanism is an illustration of my third thesis, namely that human rights have been mainstreamed in international relations and that new tools for their active and effective enforcement are actually continuously being added to international law and to international practice. And maybe just to grab a quote from somebody who is now Europe's Mr. Human Rights, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis. He's the EU Special Representative for Human Rights. He says, the basic power of human rights resides in their universal nature. So how did I come up with the notion that universality is a core element of the very concept of human rights? My first thesis. I think if you look at the historic development of human rights being derived from natural law, from being something that is outside the divine and still found in every human person, just by virtue of birth, just by virtue of being a human person. So when I did a bit of research, I found that actually next year will be the 800th anniversary of the oldest human right. This is habeas corpus, the prohibition of arbitrary arrest and detention. This was enacted in England in 1215. And of course, we've come a long way through Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the American Declaration of Independence. And what Professor Wundt said earlier on has a lot of truth to it. Not everybody agreed at all times what the substance of human rights should be. For example, you know the famous sentence of Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Or even before that, John Locke had defined fundamental rights as the right to life, liberty, and private property, which, as we've just heard, is problematic in Asia, I hear. So I personally come from a country, Austria, which was part of a larger empire in the day, and it took about 100 years for the ideas of the French Revolution to have any impact on policy making in Austria. 100 years. In 1877, the first sort of embryonic Charter of Citizens' Rights was granted by the emperor. That was long before you had any form of effective parliamentarism. Which also shows you that human rights are born out of persecution, discrimination, grievances of the individual. They lead to civil rights movement, and that yearning for human rights is something actually quite universal. But even that yearning doesn't come out of nowhere. It's actually, interestingly, the product of education. If you look at the generalization of primary education in Europe in the late 18th century, and about 50, 60, 70 years later, 1848, revolutions all over Europe, this is when for the first time some of the preconditions for people to claim their rights were given, where people were actually able to understand that beyond the social order that they had lived in all their lives, there could be something better. There could be aspirations, and there could also be relief from persecution, injustice, etc. So that's quite interesting. Now, Bremer alluded to the UN Charter, and I think jumping a few centuries now, 1945, the creation of the United Nations, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is for me the point where universality starts taking root, not just because it's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but because it's become that in practice. It has effectively united the world around most of its content. Not at once, but little by little. And this brings me to my second thesis. No? Universality actually remains an aspiration, and it remains work in progress. But incrementally but steadily, the acceptance of universality is growing. Yeah? And I think we Europeans, obviously, we're always accused of being patronizing, preaching, you know, being a bit of in a missionary spirit. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that. This is also somehow the mandate we're getting from our citizens, from our parliamentarians. Yeah? But we also have to candidly acknowledge our own human rights problems and our willingness to tackle them. And Professor Wun rightly pointed to the fact that not everybody at any point in history necessarily agrees on the content of every given right. So what's the Europeans' answer to that? We've got a mechanism. We've always got a mechanism. This is how European integration started, with coal and steel. If we disagree on something, we'll find a way of gradually, through negotiation, adjudication, or any other means, to resolve it for the future. And this is how the quite unique European system of promotion and protection of human rights came about. This is not a product primarily of the European Union. It's actually something that came out of the Council of Europe, with the European Convention of Human Rights of 1950, which set up a commission. Little by little, the Court of Justice became the central focal point of remedy, and all of a sudden, since 2000 roughly, every individual living in a country of the Council of Europe and having exhausted national remedies, can claim redress for violations of the European Charter of Human Rights in front of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So this is where you've started from. If you want to look at all the ways you can enforce human rights, multilateral, by reporting, by state complaints, one nation complaining about another's violations, which very often doesn't really happen because you have other interests and ties. Individual complaints. This is a huge step change once you have individual complaints. And of course you need transparency, you need trusted international institutions that can report and that can sort of make the debate less emotional, less confrontational, and make sure that somehow the issues are resolved rather than spiraling out of control and becoming politicized. And if I look at the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, I was reminded of something that I studied in my university days. Maybe you've heard of the Helsinki Final Act. It was the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was the first organ that bridged liberal Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. And they came up with a lot of provisions on territorial integrity and economic cooperation. But the most enduring legacy of the Helsinki Final Act was actually the so-called third basket, where rights were enshrined and were accepted by the countries of the communist bloc, which led in turn to some civil society activity, which led to the point where Helsinki committees were set up in all the participating countries. And if you look 15, 20 years after that, the transformation that the formerly communist countries have undergone until joining the European Union, becoming part of the EU and all its instruments, this was really started then, when you had a minimum consensus, and it's not necessarily that everybody agreed on everything, but the citizens took it upon themselves to breathe life into the rights that they had been given at the international level. And I think one final point on that. There's a lot of mechanisms, institutions. We have a fundamental rights agency. We try as much as possible to have an inward-outward coherence, which is difficult, of course. You should always be living in line with what you preach. But it's easy to have one voice, the High Representative, Catherine Ashton, preaching, but it's not always easy to have 28 member states implementing. So this is also part of the EU experience, that every consensus that you arrive at needs to trickle down to the ground, and the first line of defense of human rights will always be the national mechanism, the national institution to enforce human rights. And Professor Koh highlighted that the EU achieved to bring peace, democracy and human rights to Europe, and this is exactly what it says in the rationale for granting the EU the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. So this is a bit the end of that history. Now at the global level, you have seen quite a similar process, where institutions, especially after 1993, the Vienna Conference, were set up. You have the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which was just taken over now by Prince Zayed of Jordan, who is the first Asian in that role. So everybody is very much looking forward to how he will fill the shoes of former High Commissioner Navi Pillay, very impressive lady. And another enduring legacy of 1993 is the regional mechanisms. This is how you had the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, followed by the court. This is how you have the mechanism of the African Union. And this is also how down the line you have IHR and the ASEAN Declaration. This is actually a product of 1993. Now, I think I'll stop there for my first two theses, and I'll jump to what is, I think, the logical consequence of what I've just explained in historic terms, is that the promotion and protection of human rights has been mainstreamed in international relations, and tools for their effective enforcement are continuously being added. There's no question that human rights are a product of history, but history goes on, values evolve globally and locally. So universality rests on an effective and rules-based system, internationally, regionally, nationally. So this is where the EU is usually seen as preaching. This is where Catherine Ashton says human rights are the silver thread that runs through the common foreign and security policy. She has said that many times. There was the joint communication to the European Parliament. There's the EU strategic framework on human rights, both of which were adopted in the last 2-3 years under Catherine Ashton's responsibility. And what is it about? It's about the EU encouraging the ratification of international human rights treaties. It's pushing for higher standards for their enforcement. And this is also an effort that is, of course, shared with the 28 member states. It's not just, the External Action Service standing there and waving the flag of human rights, but this is something that is really a shared effort of European countries within the EU and neighboring countries. Usually you will see the accession countries, as well as Switzerland, Norway, and a few other friends. They will very often associate themselves also with what the EU has to say. So, coming to a conclusion, I have a few points that I wanted to throw out for the discussion, but many of those have been raised already by Professor Wun. Questions like Islamism, LGBT rights, and so on. So I think these will come up in the discussion anyway. My take on it is that, tolerance and respect for other human beings are key to universality. There cannot be universality if there is not tolerance and respect for each other. So in conclusion, I've tried to illustrate that you cannot talk about human rights without talking about universality, because universality is ingrained in the very notion of human rights. And I've also tried to show that beyond being just an abstract concept, universality is today a programmatic ambition for the ongoing development of a global human rights culture. We are not there, we're on our way there, and as Bremer has said, this is something that needs everybody's involvement. And I would say, finally, that the good news is that despite the challenges, I see that the culture of human rights in policy and practice is gradually spreading. And if you look at how the requirement of compliance with human rights standards is being mainstreamed in the development of international law and in global policy discussions, this is something I find very encouraging. I'll end by giving you two examples. Not long ago, you had this horrible incident of an American journalist being beheaded at the hands of ISIS. No? And the Singapore government took a very strong stance in their statement, and they said this is a grave violation of human rights. I think that this is a very commendable stance on this issue. And the other point I wanted to raise is when I witnessed, and you were there, Professor Ko, when Minister Shanmugam gave out the first award for the Arts Prize for Human Rights, to Mr. Khairul Azibin Utli, who produced the most representative drawing on the concept of human rights as they should be put into practice in ASEAN. So let me close by saying I hope we'll have a good discussion. I've been asked also to say a few words specifically on the EU stance on the death penalty and on the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. I think I leave that for the discussion, but I just wanted you to know that I'm happy, of course, to discuss these as well as we go into the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm afraid I'm not a very good timekeeper tonight. All the three speakers exceeded their 15 minutes. I think in future, Margaret, we need a timekeeper. So with your permission, we'll go on to about 9:15, you think? Yeah? It's because it's 20 minutes to 9, so we'll go on to 9:15. So I want to take questions from you. I would like the students to ask a question. Let's take 3 questions at a time. Please go to the microphone. Angus, you want to ask the first question? The two sides. There should be another microphone in the middle now.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
My question is for Professor Walter. Yeah, so it sounds like one of the key points that you mentioned is that the principle is universal, but the content may not be so. So, in that sense, right, can you explain a bit more about the limits of the content? Because one of the key limits that we talked about is respect and tolerance for each individual. But how do we implement the content itself? Because we understand that the principle, everyone agrees that there should be universal human rights, but how exactly do we define the content and the subject, the substance itself? How do we form an implementation for countries?
Walter, did you get the question? Okay, let's take 2 more questions. Another question, please. Hi.
Good evening.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Don. I'm a year 2 student from statistics. I have a question for the panel, but I guess the focus would be on Mr. Bernhard. I would like to ask about a case of gross violation of human rights. It's not a case of, like according to the words of Professor Walter, 50 Shades of Grey. It's a case of black and white. That is the gross violation of human rights in North Korea. What does the UN think about it? What do you intend to do about it? Because From what I have read, North Korea is receiving backings from China, who is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and their power and influence are growing over time. So, and it's unlikely that they will withdraw their backing to North Korea. The case of
All right,
North Korea. Yeah.
Okay, so your question is, if you take a case of a country like North Korea, which in his point of view commits egregious violations of human rights, what can the world do about it? Your question is for Bernhard, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, one more question. A question for Bremer, please. We've had one question for Walter, one for Bernhard. Can I have a question for Bremer? One more question. Yes.
Hi, actually I do have a question for Ms. Bremer. It's not so much a question, it's more a point of clarification. You mentioned that we need to shift from a human-oriented approach to a human-centric approach. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Okay. Yeah, I also didn't understand what she meant. So what's the difference between people-oriented and people-centric? So we have three questions. Walter first, and then Bernhard, and then Bremer.
Okay, thank you. Angus, right? Who asked the question about, not Angus? Was it Angus? Yeah. Yes. Who asked the question about how do you define the content and limits? The problem is that there is no central authority. That is the problem. We do not have a universal body that says this is how you interpret it. And there are societal and cultural differences in interpretation of a right which everyone accepts is a right. The example I gave, for example, was freedom of expression. We all accept that you should have freedom of expression. But I also think that there is consensus that the freedom of expression cannot be absolute. Even in America, it is not absolute. So there are limits. Who decides those limits? The answer is there is no central body.
But what about the UN Human Rights Council? Is that not a central body?
But even the UN Human Rights Council is not accepted as the final arbiter of the limits. This is the point. And there will be always political debates until the UN Council is accepted as that final arbiter. I don't think that you will have consensus.
Well,
no.
De facto, it is the arbiter. And there is periodic review, actually, of all member states' human rights record. Every 3 years, we are subject to review, universal review.
Well, I defer to Professor Koh's knowledge of this. But the point is that I'm not sure that that is actually true. The UN may preach, but the UN has no mechanism to enforce. This is the problem. They may say what they like, people will ignore them, right? And when it comes to domestic politics or domestic interest, you can be sure that realpolitik is going to trump principle.
Absolutely.
This is going to be the case. Yeah. We see it happening all the time, right? So yes, there is a theory and there is a practice, right? Whatever the central body may say, governments may sign up. If we look at if you look at just the ASEAN Declaration, even the ASEAN Charter, this was adopted by ASEAN leaders. Do we sincerely believe that ASEAN leaders are going to follow what they have set up?
We hope so.
I would say, don't hold your breath. I am a skeptic.
Oh no, don't
Professor
say that.
Koh is much more optimist. I have said before in print, ASEAN is an organization that is driven by hot air and idealism. Right? And he said, please don't write that down, but I did. So realpolitik will always trump principle. And I think the history of international relations does not give us cause for optimism. So coming back to Angus's question, there is no de facto, each society decides where the limits are. There is no mechanism to force compliance. And when it comes to national interest, it doesn't matter what the international community says. Each country says, we have to protect our national interests. We're not going to see riots on our street for the sake of some abstract principle of freedom of expression. Right? Let me give you one concrete example, if I may. Right? When we talk about freedom of expression, I met in England a Kenyan lady who was in fact also basically not hostile to human rights. She was in favor of this. There were riots in Nairobi after an election. And the Kenyan government said, look, we need a news clampdown so as not to exacerbate the situation. And this Kenyan lady is not hostile to human rights. The government said, we need a clampdown. The Western news agencies said, no, we have a right to express our views and to report. And they did. And they inflamed the situation. They inflamed it. Now, I have some sympathy from the Kenyans' point of view, because this lady was saying they just made it worse by insisting on their doctrinaire insistence on freedom of expression. People died because of that. So when you talk about national interest will trump. And when you talk about potentially people dying or riots on your streets, it's not so easy to say let the UN decide, because the UN is in New York. We are here. We have to live with it.
I guess this is a very good case where maybe Bernhard and Bremer, you can both jump in, where a country has to weigh your commitment to freedom of speech on the one hand and your competing interest in maintaining public order and harmony. So different countries will come down differently on how that equilibrium is calibrated. Some countries would come down more on the side of freedom of speech, and other countries will come down more on maintenance of public order and harmony. Bernhard, your turn. Can you give us a more optimistic view of the world than Walter?
I'll try my best. Now, maybe the good news could start with an interesting quote. Yeah? This is something I found doing research for tonight. Listen carefully. The pursuit of the improvement of human rights never ends, for there is always room for better human rights conditions. Greater efforts are needed to bring higher standards to human rights protection. Now, this sounds like something straight out of an EU statement, yeah? But this is the National Human Rights Report of the People's Republic of China, published in May 2014. Yeah? So, I think there's a bit of good news around the corner, even if there is also a lot of bad news. Now, on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, this has been a standing item on the Third Committee of the United Nations, which does social issues, human rights, for as long as I can think. Yeah? So the UN system has definitely strongly reacted to the situation in North Korea. The General Assembly passes a resolution every year, which is adjusted, adapted, depending on developments and circumstances there. The Human Rights Council, of course, can work on these issues, and I think almost every nation on earth is on record saying something not exactly positive about the human rights record of the DPRK. But there we're also, of course, hitting kind of a brick wall, as Professor Won has said. The international order does not really foresee sanctions for this kind of violations. In the end, sovereign states have to enforce their human rights obligations within their territory. And even if there has been this whole debate, especially in the 1990s, about humanitarian intervention and so on, I think we're a little bit beyond this. So now we're probably in a phase of history where we acknowledge also the limitations of the system, but we need to work with what we've got. And on the whole, the trend is relatively positive, because democracy has been progressing over the last 20 years, rule of law has been progressing over the last 20 years, and human rights are slowly but gradually making their way into the mainstream of the politics of most countries around the world. There are outliers, and usually we discuss the outliers, inevitably, yeah? But this should not distract us from the fact that actually the overall trend is a rather positive one. And if you're looking now, of course, at Iraq, Syria, and some egregious situations, I will grant to you that the last 2 years have not been good to human rights. Since the so-called Arab Spring, you've seen a lot of deterioration in North Africa and the Middle East. That is definitely a situation of concern.
So can I provoke you and ask you, as a European, do you have any any pangs of guilt when you look at the situation in the Middle East and North Africa today, and you just remember that that European countries like France, Germany were part of the effort to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya? I mean, Gaddafi was not a good person, but when you overthrew Gaddafi, and your intention was good, but look at the aftermath of your behavior. I don't know whether the Libyan people are better off today, or whether they were better off under this bad ruler Gaddafi. Or look at the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 to overthrow a bad person, Saddam Hussein. But the result of the American intervention is probably worse for the Iraqi people than before, you know. And look at Syria, the Western attempt to overthrow Assad. Bashar Assad resulted in a bloody civil war with half the people becoming refugees, the country destroyed. Do you as a European have any guilty conscience about this?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, history will be the judge. Yeah, I think this is where I need to skirt the question a little bit and say there was never a common EU position on overthrowing Gaddafi. There was never a common EU position on intervening in Syria, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that doesn't mean that some member states of the European Union may not have played a role in this. I will definitely grant to you that that has been the case. But there you also probably see the limitations of European integration and the common foreign and security policy as a whole. We operate on the basis of consensus. So if a member state decides to go on their own with the assets that they have at their disposal, that is it. Yeah? So we have to gradually build probably more trust, more transparency, and more commonality of interests among the member states of the European Union to make sure that when they act together. And I think the counterexample is the crisis in Ukraine, where despite a huge, wide range of links that different countries of the European Union have to Russia, many of them depending on Russia for the supply of natural gas, some relying on Russia for a lot of their exports of agriculture and other goods. Still, the Union largely stood as one.
But Ukraine raises a different issue. And I want to bring you back to the Middle East, because I think the Europeans and Americans should have a bad conscience about what they've done in the Middle East. No, I really mean that. I mean, it's of course easier to be wise after the event, right? But there's an English saying that the path to hell is paved with good intention. So President George W. Bush may have the good intention of overthrowing a dictator, Saddam Hussein, or bringing democracy to Iraq, but he didn't know that when he overthrew Saddam Hussein, when he disbanded the Iraqi army, when he dissolved the Ba'ath Party, all the institutions that held Iraq together were dissolved. And when he introduced democracy into Iraq, you have a Shia majority that came to power. And the leader of the Shia majority was not wise enough to construct an inclusive government, and he constructed a government that discriminated against the Sunnis and the Kurds. And the net effect is you have civil war in Iraq. And I would say the Iraqi people are worse off today than they were under Saddam. And I would also say the Libyan people are worse off today than they were under Gaddafi. There's a situation of total chaos in Libya, you know, of militias governing different pockets of the country. So when you Europeans and Americans go about the world with your missionary zeal to overthrow bad regimes, to promote democracy. Are you sure you know enough about the history, the heritage, the internal dynamics of this country before you act? You can leave, but you leave this country in chaos. So you should be more humble. I think the Europeans and Americans should be more humble.
Granted.
Okay, Bernhard wants to answer a question.
One final sentence. I think Iraq, Libya, and to a certain degree Syria have been some of the issues that really split the Union across. Yeah? And there were member states who took part in operations in Iraq, and there were member states who profoundly rejected the notion that there should be an intervention in Iraq. Yeah? And this has thrown back the common foreign security policy 10 years at least. Yeah? And there will be these instances, but politicians will make their decisions on the basis of what they think the consensus in their country is. That's life.
Okay. Bremer wants to answer the question. What's the difference between
a few more
people-oriented and people-centric?
Yes. I think all the discussions at the table now come back to this fundamental point, people-oriented or people-centered. When we decide on policies, when we decide on laws, when we decide on the action plan for a country, etc., where are the people? That is what the issue came up on the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. People-oriented, where are the people? I think about you, I work with you. Sometimes you're in the center, sometimes you may not be. The question of having it as people-centered means decision-making, processes by governments, etc., will have to make people as a primary objective. This, like what I put over there, what is the relationship in going forward between the state, between the people, the private sector, etc. So what is our model? Some of our countries is very hierarchical. Some of it is a bit more flat. And I cite one example that I've stated many times about Thailand. Many of us raise our eyebrows, wow, Thailand, red shirts, yellow shirts, etc. Yes, people have died. It is sad, it is unfortunate, etc. But I still think in the ASEAN context, we wouldn't have two big factions at each other ideologically and still maintaining a relative calm and understanding democracy, as I think I have seen in Thailand. If such a thing were to happen, let's say, touch wood, in Singapore or in any of our ASEAN countries, will we have that respect, plus anger, plus frustration, plus grievance and everything, but enough of an understanding to know, I don't agree with you, but we just have to jostle with each other and get to somewhere. And I think that is what we mean by people-centered, vis-a-vis people-oriented.
I'm not following your argument. You're saying the confrontation between red shirts and yellow shirts has a positive lesson for us, is it?
Has a positive lesson for us in terms of
what's the positive lesson?
The positive lesson is in terms of understanding how people who have grown with an understanding of democracy will be able to appreciate difference in views. I think that is very important in a world today where we have a lot of diversity of views, where allegiance and alliance with political parties, whether I believe in the monarchy, I do not, will all come to rise to the surface. So how do I develop an approach to diversity becomes a challenge. What I am saying, Prof, is that in another country, perhaps, this will be a major collision.
I beg to disagree.
Okay, that's fine. But that's how I see it.
I beg to disagree, and let me explain my view.
Okay.
In Thailand, the former Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra had won a democratic election, and she was appointed as Prime Minister. The yellow shirt movement that were opposed to her could not defeat her in the election, so they took to the streets and they paralyzed the country for 6 months. You know, so I don't think there's a positive thing. I don't think there's a positive development. If you believe in democracy, then you should play by the rules of the game. If you lose an election, you should accept the outcome, wait your time, wait for the next election and try to defeat the government. You don't react to an electoral loss by mounting daily demonstrations on the street, paralyze the government, and then provoke the army to take over. So I don't think that's a positive development. You know? So I must disagree with Bremer on this.
Can I just say something? I'm not having an argument, but I'm just saying that one is looking at outcome. I'm not looking at outcome. I'm looking at process. But it's fine. Yeah, I think the process is very important because it could have led to much more bloodshed.
Yeah. Yes, but if people believe in democracy, you must accept the outcome of an election, and you must wait for the next election to overthrow the government in power. You don't take to the streets to bring the government down and to provoke an army to take over the government. I think that's wrong. You know, if you're a Democrat, I don't think you should do that. Let's take 3 more questions. You start first.
Hi. Hi, my name is Shian. I'm a final year student from engineering. The question that I have is that whether there exists an objective human rights. Perhaps I could bring an analogy from science where, like for example, for centuries we lived under Newtonian physics, and then Einstein came along and he showed that, well, actually there's a better interpretation of how the world works, the universe works. And although there was a consensus building, scientists had to buy into the idea. It was based on the fact that, well, this is objectively how the universe works. So we talked a lot about like how human rights you have at the international level, regional level, national level, where you have to buy in on the idea. But is there actually an objective definition of human rights that perhaps all of our different definitions will converge towards?
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Brother Basu.
My primary question is to Prof. Woon, but I would like the views of all the panelists on this issue. I want to focus on 2 events in Singapore in recent times. One is the growing popularity of the Pink Dot movement and the questions on the decriminalization of homosexuality. I know we debated Section 377A just a few years ago in Parliament and decided to keep it. But I hear Prof. Woon when he says that each society has to decide what constitutes rights. And I also hear that you alluded to the culture wars in the United States, but I've been reading a lot of, and young people here have been quite passionate and have gone online with their views, and people are comparing how we're dealing with 377A with the whole gambling issue, where a whole lot of Singaporeans disapproved of gambling, but it was never illegal, and we have casinos today. So what is your view on 377A? Is it too soon to review it again? I'm not talking about gay marriage but just decriminalization. Okay. The second thing is on Tan Pin Pin's film and where your views on Tan Pin Pin's film on Singapore exiles, and do you think it should have been banned outright?
Okay. All right, 2 questions for you, Walter. Let's take another question from here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Naveen, Year 3 Geographer. My question is actually related to Ms. Basu, so I think you all can answer it together. My question is the deployment of the discourse of human rights just political strategy in the end? Like, if it's productive to use it...
I'm sorry, say that again?
Is the deployment of the discourse of human rights just political strategy in the end? Is it just a matter of political strategy, or is it a driver, or should it be a driver of society? Realistically, is it just political strategy?
Okay, thank you. Your question, please.
Hi. Hello. Okay, I'm Nicholas, a Year 1 student from Arts. So I'm very sympathetic towards the human rights cause, and I think that human rights were created with the idea of progressing the world, especially in the socio-economical and cultural context within which it was created. However, I feel that human rights stand on very subjective ground. Human rights were created by people who had humanist, libertarian, and individualistic leanings that can be seen very clearly in their work. These ideals are hardly universal, and they are mostly Western-centric. Empirically, I would think the West is a small though influential demographic. How can it, by its own individualist, humanist, and perhaps democratic standard, claim to be universal without insulting the intelligence of everyone not in the West? And secondly, Prof. Walter alluded to the human rights being a form of religion in increasingly atheistic West. And I think my question is somewhat similar to his. So what would you say to the charge that human rights suffer from the same problems that plague any religion, such as being politicized, especially since it tries to be universal?
Okay, all right, thank you. So your first question, I think, is for Bernhard. Your second question for Walter and Bremer, I think, yeah? Okay, your question, please.
Hi, I'm Junie. I'm a Year 3 communication student. And my question is actually for Ms. Mathi. Given that ASEAN runs on the principles of consultation, consensus, and non-interference, do you see any way of reconciling these principles with your aim for an effective human rights mechanism that aims to promote, protect, and fulfill?
Thank you. Finally, your question.
Yes, I'm Go Young, a Year 1 art student. Basically, in this current world and this setting, there's a lot of very, very contentious issues, such as, say, terrorism. So I'll give you like a standard analogy, which is basically, if say you have a terrorist someone you suspect as a terrorist, but are unable to confirm because you want to respect his human right that he will be innocent until proven guilty, but he's in charge of a bomb who will destroy maybe an entire city and cause thousands of lives to be lost, will you forsake his human right to uphold the human right of other people?
So, in other words, you're saying that if you know that he's going to kill thousands of people, will you take him out? Is it?
Yes, for two scenarios. One scenario being that you are sure that he's a terrorist. The other scenario being that you're not sure that you cannot prove that he's a terrorist, and therefore you cannot go against his so-called human right because he's not proven guilty.
Your question is too difficult for him. Let's take one more question. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Anikant, and I'm a Year 1 student from engineering. And my question's a little more simpler. How we are discussing our human rights universal right means we are saying that what I interpret it as our countries following it. But as our panelists have earlier on mentioned that many countries, they have different cultures, backgrounds, and cultures and how they had their traditions. So my question is, can human rights even be truly universal? Like one shoe cannot fit all sizes, right? So can one set of declaration actually fit all countries? Like,
but you're just repeating the question of our forum.
No, like, is it like, for example, Sharia law?
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. So let me ask in reverse order, Bernhard, then Bremer, then Walter to reply to all the questions. Bernhard, you want to start first? You can answer any of the questions.
Thank you. And also
you have 5 minutes.
To take those in reverse order, if I may. See, I hope I can find this again. In my research, I found a lovely article by Shashi Tharoor, who used to be also the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations for Public Affairs. No, this is an article that's about 15 years old now, and that makes reference to this cultural relativism discussion. No? And I hope I can find the quote here, but he says, I'll share it with you. It's an absolutely, or maybe Dr. Tan can share it with the students. Yeah? Basically, his point is that the ethnocentrism of human rights is also a relative concept, that you cannot just decide that human rights are not universal because there are certain elements of your culture that are in contradiction with certain elements of human rights. He takes, of course, the example of the self-immolation of widows in Indian culture. Yeah? But he also relativizes it. And his conclusion is to say that the challenge, this is the quote I think I was looking for, the challenge is to work towards the indigenization of human rights and their assertion within each country's traditions and history. Yeah? There can be different approaches. There must be a certain degree of flexibility to guarantee universality. This is his core argument. Yeah? Human rights derive from the mere fact of being human. They're not a gift of a particular government or legal code. Yeah? But the challenge is to work towards the indigenization of human rights. I think that that's an excellent point he makes, and I'm happy to share that with you. So that's for the question, different cultures, different backgrounds. Terrorism, yeah, I mean, we've heard that one before, and it's very hard to take that decision if you have to, yeah? Are you going to lock up somebody on suspicion that he might commit a crime or not? I think in Europe, we have certainly also tightened our anti-terrorism legislation in the aftermath of 9/11, so probably it was more skewed to the rights of the defense until 9/11. There's probably been a swing in the other direction lately, but we've certainly not gone as far as, for instance, the US in setting up exceptional jurisdiction, secret tribunals, extrajudicial detention. So you have to find a middle path, I guess. Yeah? And for the time being in Europe, we're trying to find that middle ground where the rights of the defense are credibly protected and the safety and security of the general public is guaranteed as much as possible. So this is where we are on this. Are these the questions I was supposed to answer to the film? Yeah. Individualism and religion. Maybe a quick word on that. It is clear, and that is indeed an ideological question, that human rights came about in an environment that allowed thought outside religion. Yeah? We have to be aware of that. And this is something that is a very particular conjuncture of Europe in the early industrial age. Yeah? And it certainly didn't happen everywhere at the same time. And there are probably in Europe today still societies that are a lot more religious than others, and where limitations on free speech, say in relation to religion, may be stronger than in others, and that includes the country that I'm from, where actually, blasphemy in the broadest sense is a crime. It's not a human rights issue, yeah? But it's pretty clear that you cannot just insult another religion. You're actually not even supposed to insult your own, which sometimes is problematic. But this is how you end up arguing cases in court, and these are interesting cases, and which also shows you, as Professor Walter Wundt said, there are many shades of grey, but in the end you need somebody to decide. You need a mechanism. You need a jurisdiction to clarify what the rights are in each individual case, and that's what rule of law is there for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Brenna?
Thank you for your questions. On human rights, whether it's a political strategy or whatever, I think it is actually, sometimes it is a bit redundant because human rights will be politicized, whether it's by governments, whether it's by NGOs, etc. And sometimes it will not be. It will move through various stages. One has come across situations where I think it has been politicized. For example, I think whenever we have a case of religion especially, it can be politicized very quickly by whichever party is involved. So I think it will move through various stages as an entity. But I think at the individual level, we have to be very clear that we do not get into this fray of just wanting to politicize human rights. So in the context of Singapore 377A and everything that Radha brought up, it will be politicized, and at the same time, it will not be politicized. Individuals will feel, I just want it, but there will have to be a movement. There are already various movements wanting to ask for the 377A to be repealed. It's a long road. I do not know how long the road is going to be, how many people will jump on it, and whether what is the nature. I know we have this problem with the word protest, and right now the protest is all confined to the speaker's corner. How long will that continue? I think these are some real questions as Singapore we need to ask ourselves. It's already bursting at the seams on some topics. People will keep going. After a while, they will feel nothing is moving. Then it moves into another level. So I think that is when it can get very politicized. So the state hopefully will, instead of clamping down, will begin the whole process of at the table, let's dialogue, let's talk about it, and how much can I give you, etc. I think that is very crucial. I think that also answers your objectivity and subjectivity question. I don't think human rights can be objective, as we have already discussed, that universal is I wouldn't like to put it as aspiration. I think it is a principled approach. But when we reach there, we'll take various, it will go through us at various stages, at various times, and what systems have we got, and education. I mean, sorry, Prof, just a few more minutes. I have, as Marwa, we have written to the Minister of Education asking whether we are going to include human rights education in the school system. And if you just go and Google human rights education, they are fun projects, not this heavy-duty Article 1, Article 2. They are fun things. Children will have a lot of fun learning how to cope and analyze with different situations. I don't think we are ready, but other countries are doing it, and it becomes a discussion around values. How do I give you space? How do I keep my space? Which is becoming a very important discussion. The last part that I want to bring in on the consultation, second last one, the consultation. It is very frustrating working at ASEAN level. Sometimes I think it's also frustrating working at the national level. I think there is no choice in the matter once you have committed yourself to human rights advocacy work. You move, and then you will move back, and it goes on. However, having said that, we have had some achievements, not we as Marwa, as an entity. We have had some achievements at ASEAN level where there's a proper review, I don't know where it will end, on migrant workers' declaration. The unions are coming in, and some unions are shifting position. All that will take a lot of lobbying. It may not be 1 year, it can even be 2-3 years. At the national level, I think one of the success has been the mandatory death penalty. It has not just come out like that. There has been a lot of lobbying back and forward. At least now the mandatory is, I think, for a moment, for the long, I think it is, I think it's not going to be applied anymore, but we still have the death penalty, and human rights advocates will always believe that that is not a solution. Sorry. So the terrorist, if he's really going to kill everybody, then I think the security forces are quite silly if they're going to stand by and watch, right? They have to act on it. But if you are unsure about it, then I think there must be a proper interrogation process and access to information on how the person has been interrogated and what is really the charge at the end of the day. So that brings me to the last point on Singapore. We have detention without trial. It is going to be the longest road I think we are going to walk as human rights advocates. It is long. But if we are committed, we have to start. It has already started. We have to keep going on at it to see, is it fair to detain you on a suspicion without a trial, without charging you in court? So these are some of our challenges. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. Walter?
Okay, thank you. Normally when people throw me live grenades, I throw them away. But since Radha has thrown me a couple of live grenades, let me deal with them. First, Tan Pin Pin's film. I cannot comment because I'm a member of the Film's Appeal Committee. If she appeals, it'll come to us. You understand, I hope, why I will not say anything. Decriminalization of Section 377A. I will say on record that I'm in favor of decriminalization. Right? But there is a problem. Okay, okay, I'm sorry, it's been a long day and I've been thinking law all the time, so my head is stuffed, but let me try and explain that, right? 377A does not criminalize homosexuality. It criminalizes homosexual acts between males. And there is a big difference. You can be as gay as you want. You can be all the way from mildly gay to flamboyantly ecstatic. No one cares. It's not an offense. it's only when you have sex between males. As a practical matter, it is impossible to prove. It is absolutely impossible to prove as a practical matter, first. Secondly, as a matter of principle, if you accept that these are consenting adults, then why should it be a jailing thing? So there's that problem. The complication is there's a religious dimension to this because St. Paul says that this is a sin, and many people believe that. But adultery is also a sin, and this is a problem thing. If it's a sin, it's between you and God. We don't jail adulterers, we don't stone them anymore. Fornication is a sin, but it happens all the time. We don't jail them, right? So there's no difference. There is a problem with 377A in the sense, a constitutional problem, because if the Prime Minister says it's a law and it's still a crime, but we're not going to prosecute it, then we have a constitutional problem. So under the Constitution, Article 35, Clause 8, the decision whether to prosecute or not lies with the public prosecutor. And so we have a very dangerous precedent here, where the political authorities are saying to the public prosecutor, who's supposed to be independent, there are some laws that you don't enforce. I find that very uncomfortable, right? So 377A, personal view, not the government's view, certainly not my official view when I was Attorney General, because as Attorney General, you take the law as it is, not as you wish it to be, right? But personal view, I'd say repeal the thing. There is going to be political pushback. This is a political problem, but I don't think that so many people feel so strongly about it that the government's going to fall over this, right? Human rights as a religion, objective human rights. Okay, fine. There has always been a very missionary element to Western society when they justified colonialism in terms of a civilizing mission. If you look at the Spanish and the French, it was actually there. And to some extent, the British. So there was always this idea, we have to civilize these barbarians. There was always them, the heathens, the barbarians. In a de-Christianized Europe, what has taken the place of Christianity is human rights. And it is the same type of fervor, that we are the ones who know best, we decide what is best for the world, we will preach to you. And I've had this argument in Brussels, with people in Brussels. I said, listening to Europe preach is like listening to a priest preach hell and damnation when you know that he's been buggering the choristers in the vestry. This is the problem. This is why it raises hackles, because of the history and because of the way colonialism went. Those on the receiving end of the colonialism have heard these arguments before in a different guise. So there's always been that certain self-righteousness. The other point about it being a religion is that there's a theological argument which cannot be solved. It can never, it's a theological argument. Are there objective human rights? It's like any other theological argument. I say yes, you say no. What do we have? We don't have a single divine authority to tell us what it is on human rights. That is the problem. The final question is about, what was that? The rights of the individual, rights of the many, the fellow with the bomb, right? That was the question about the fellow with the bomb. Terrorism. Okay, let's be very clear about this, okay? Because this is a real problem that we have. Some of you gentlemen may have, during your NS, have been part of 9 SIR or serve your reserve in one of 9 SIR's reserve battalions, installation protection. You are on installation protection duty, and there is a potential terrorist with a bomb who could kill dozens, if not hundreds. You are protecting, say, Jurong Island, a bomb there could be enormously damaging. You have got your 5 rounds of ammunition for your SAR-21. Do you fire or do you not? It is a real problem. If we cast it in terms of human rights, it's very hard to answer that. But you cast it in terms of what is my responsibility as the person who is responsible for the protection of the public and the interest, the answer is much clearer. I shoot. And if I'm wrong, I take the consequences. But I have a responsibility to do that. So the rules of engagement, if you look at it from the point of view of responsibility, are we balance off the potential harm against the damage to the individual. And if the potential harm is that high, then we must accept that we must shoot. And if mistakes are made, then we pay compensation. Small comfort, but still, there is that problem. And this is actually recognized in our penal code, section 79, defense of mistake. It was amended in 2007 precisely to postulate situations like this. That if you shoot and you turn out to be mistaken, there is a defense, complete defense, right? So balancing rights of the individual against the interests of the many, it's not a question of rights. It's a question of you're responsible, what do you do, right? So hard questions, can't answer in 10 minutes. This is the best I can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you. Bremer wants to have a very brief response.
Just a brief thing on
to Walter.
3778, not Walter's, to just add on. It's the Sodomy Act, as Prof. Walter has also put it forward, but Singapore is a secular state. So it is a real problematic issue when we are secular, and how do we hold this up because of faith-based contradictions. So that is one. Two, if we take away the 377A, then there is also a worry about same partner relationship. So every time this comes up, the society has to be ready, and that is a human rights discussion. Does society have to get ready, or do we do what is right by the individual? So with that, I rest.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I apologize to you for not being a good timekeeper. We're half hour late. I'll try better the next time. Let me conclude by saying that I agree with all the three speakers. I agree with Bernhard that that in general, human rights are universal, and I can point to many specific human rights which are universal in content, in interpretation and application. I think the prohibition against genocide, slavery, torture are good examples, of human rights which are truly universal. Yes, and you cannot say, well, genocide is permissible in this particular context, or torture is permissible in this context. I think genocide, slavery, torture are impermissible everywhere, at all times, under all circumstances. But I also agree with Walter that life is not so simple, and the world is more complicated than that. And there are situations in which the interpretation and application of a specific human right has to take into account the context, the country's history, its heritage, its religious tradition. And Walter referred to a real case at the UN when more than 30 Islamic countries asked the UN to adopt a new resolution recognizing that a person has a right to worship his own faith, and that others should not demean his faith. Others should not, badmouth or demean his faith. It is something that Singaporeans would accept, But to Europeans and Americans, this is not acceptable because they feel that your right to worship your faith in dignity should not compromise my right to freedom of speech, including my right to criticize Islam, So here is a case where there's no agreement on what's the right thing to do, So there are complicated situations in which it's not clear whether freedom of speech is more important or the protection of public order and harmony is more important. I also agree very much with Bremer that that it's very important in the new world in which we live for the state, for the private sector and the civil society to work as co-equals. I wouldn't say one is more important than others. I think that I would like to see a state of equilibrium in which the state the private sector and civil society work as co-equals. And that to me would be the ideal situation. I want to answer rather by saying that abolishing 377A is not so simple. Personally, I agree with Walter that this particular provision of penal code should be done away with. But if you are in the government and you look at the opinion polls, look at the IPS opinion poll, a majority of Singaporeans believe that homosexuality is wrong. A majority of Singaporeans are against the repeal of 377A. You know, so if you were the government, what do? You know, do you say that that the minority is right and the majority is wrong, and Parliament should repeal 377A? Or do you say, I will compromise? And the current government position is a compromise. It is to say we recognize that a majority of Singaporeans want to retain 377A in our penal code, but we also recognize a substantial minority feel it is wrong to enforce this law against two consenting adults who have who commit sodomy in private. And so the compromise is that we have the law in the book, but we will not enforce the law. Walter, as a good lawyer, is not comfortable with that. He feels that if you have a law in the book, then you have an obligation to enforce it. But if you're a politician, yeah, but I'm just saying that it is a very difficult, I mean, we should not underestimate the difficulty of coming down clearly on one side or the other, no? If you repeal 377A, you're going against a majority of your citizens. If you, yeah. Still, majority are. No, actually, IPS had an opinion poll. This is a different issue. Huh? Yeah, we did an opinion poll before the government decided whether to allow casinos to operate in Singapore. We did an opinion poll, and we found that Singaporeans were divided on this issue, roughly between one-third, and one-third. One-third of Singaporeans are against the casino unconditionally. One-third of Singaporeans are in favor of casino unconditionally. And one-third of Singaporeans are in favor of casino with conditions. Yeah. And this is not for reporting. I actually pleaded with the Prime Minister to have a referendum. I felt this was a wonderful case where we could have a referendum. But the government thought referendum not a good idea. And they decided that it should be the Parliament that would decide. So they basically went with approving casino with conditions, you know, yeah. Actually, a majority favors that. Yeah. So I want to bring this to a close. I thank the three speakers. Thank you, Bernhard, very much. Let's give Bernhard a round of applause. Let's thank Bremer Marty. Let's thank Walter Woon. And thank all the students for the good question. Thank you.
I said I was among three diplomats